Do you have an older video game console that only outputs RF video, but you want to connect it to a scaler that only has composite video inputs or higher? Sure, you could pick up some fancy equipment that'll do a great job in a small package, and you could even install a mod to your console that outputs composite RGB or S-video. Either are good choices, but how about just using any old VCR you could probably find for free? Just the first few minutes of this video will show you everything that you need to know, but I hope you stick around for the rest because I'm going to nerd out on a whole bunch of cool stuff. Let's begin. Okay, let's begin with what you need to get started. First, you'll need an RF adapter for your console, and almost any, or even none at all, should work. See, almost every RF-only console has the RF modulation and channel switch built right onto the console itself. Those external boxes are only needed if you also want to pass a TV signal through. Early RF boxes, like this one Mark from My Life in Gaming is showing, had a switch that toggled between the console and TV signals, while later ones like this did the switching automatically. Most people who grew up with these might not have known they're basically just a switch, which is why you could use a Sega one on a ColecoVision and so on. Since you're almost certainly not using an analog TV signal now, you could skip the RF box altogether and just get a cheap, basic RCA to coax adapter like this. Then you could use any RCA cable, or with consoles like the Atari 2600, just connect the built-in RF RCA cable right to it. The only RF box I've ever seen that worked differently was the bizarre version of the Atari 5200 that ran both power and RF to the console through the same cable. It actually worked just like every other RF switch, except this one combined power and RF to the console, presumably to just have one less cable run to the console. Atari quickly realized how unbelievably stupid a design this was and went back to separate power and RF jacks on the console. If you have one of these, it's just about the only console I've ever seen that requires its RF box and not just a coax adapter. Basically, other than that version of the 5200, if the channel switch is on the console, it's safe to assume all you'll need is a cheap RCA to coax adapter. Let me know in the comments if you know of any other weird console that has its own proprietary RF box, and if you have one of those Atari 5200 boxes, you may want to consider doing a mod that separates the power and the RF signal. Next, you do not need some fancy VCR for this. Literally any VCR that powers on will work, including ones that don't even read tapes anymore. The whole purpose of using a VCR is that you can still find them free. Heck, I got the one I'm using for this video just by asking a few friends if they had one lying around. In fact, definitely don't use any of those combo units with HDMI or component video outputs. Combo units that have separate outputs for the DVD player and VCR should be fine, but if you get one with any kind of scaling built in, there's a good chance those will add lag and process the signal wrong. I demonstrated this problem in my video about why you can't plug classic consoles directly into flat panels. That video also explains why you can't use a cheap composite to HDMI converter to play video games. I don't want to waste your time going over all that again here, so I'll just leave a link to that video in case you haven't seen it yet. Oh, and a quick note, you might see RF modulators for cheap. These are the opposite. They're composite to RF converters for people who want to connect their consoles to old CRTs that didn't have composite inputs. They won't work for this as we need the opposite, RF demodulation. Just figured I'd give you a heads up. Anyway, next you'll want a standard 2 or 3 RCA cable. The colors are just there so you'll know which ends match, but it doesn't matter what you use. A cable for component video will work the same as one for composite video. Or you could even just use one labeled for audio and just use one for video and the other for mono audio. Basically, any RCA cable is fine. If your VCR is mono only, you'll also need a cheap Y cable to output mono audio to both channels. Just buy whichever Y cable matches your 2 or 3 RCA cable setup. I'll show more about this in a second. Definitely do not go hunting down a VCR with stereo audio just for this, but if you happen to find one that outputs stereo, you'll just need 3 RCA cables, no Y cables necessary. One last disclaimer, you only need to worry about the stuff in this video if your console or retro PC doesn't have a composite video jack or higher. Stuff like the Atari 2600 or TRS-80 Color Computer 2. If there's any plug-in option for composite, like with the NES, you should use that instead, although I'll probably show the NES quite a bit in this video, just because it'll make for some good examples. Okay, that's everything you need, so let's start setting up. Now that you have everything you need, start by connecting the VCR's composite output to your scaler's composite video inputs. Remember that most RetroTink products use the green RCA jack for composite. If the VCR has stereo audio outputs, connect those as well. If your VCR only outputs mono audio, here's where you'll need that cheap Y cable to split the output so you'll get audio out of both channels. Once again, any RCA Y cable will be fine as long as the ends match your cables and setup. Now power on the VCR, set the scaler to its composite video input, and double check that you're getting a signal. You should get something on screen. Maybe a blue screen, maybe fuzz, maybe an on-screen display. If it's working, you should be able to tell right away. Now connect the RF switch box, or RCA cable with coax converter, from your console to your VCR. Make sure you connect it to the screw terminal labeled input, and while that might seem obvious, if you've never used one of these or haven't used one since you were a kid, it's easy to forget they're directional. Now power on the console and set the channel on the VCR to match whatever the console's channel switch is set to. If your console just says A and B or doesn't have any markings, it's usually channel 2, 3, or 4, at least in North America. You should just be able to use the channel up and down buttons on your VCR to tune the proper channel. Maybe there's some VCR out there that requires the remote, but almost every one I've seen works just like this one with the buttons on front. And that's it. You should be getting composite video through the VCR into your scaler. The only other thing to note is you could use this exact method with Japanese RF-only consoles, at least in North America or on any other NTSC displays. Just try tuning your VCR to channel 95 or 96. And if that doesn't work, try all the channels in the 90s, or even see if your VCR has a channel scan function to see if it could auto-detect the console while powered on. If that doesn't work, you could always import a Japanese VCR to use the same trick, but at that point it would most likely be cheaper to just do a composite video mod on the console. As a note, you could also use this method to connect an RF-only console to a monitor without RF inputs. Although, if you've invested in something like a PVM or BVM, you should really consider at least a composite video mod for the console. So if you just came here for some basic setup instructions, feel free to drop off at any time, but I do hope you'll join me for the rest, because I'm gonna have some fun. You might have heard people talk about how bad RF video quality is, but that really depends on your location. Here's a video I took of my Super Nintendo connected via RF to a CRT in a storage area where there's no wireless interference. There isn't even any cell phone service here. It basically looks like composite video. But here's the exact same SNES, TV, and RF adapter back when I lived in Manhattan. The thousands of wireless networks around me were causing so much interference that RF was basically unusable. In the right environment, RF-only consoles, or even finding a CRT with only an RF input, would be totally fine. But in the wrong environment, well, you get this. How about a less extreme example though? Here's an NES outputting RF running through that free VCR I found connected to the RetroTink 4K. At the moment, I live in the burbs, but I also have a wireless router in this room, as well as quite a few wireless devices, so it should be a pretty average example for anyone living outside of a major city. Now, I'll split the video in half, and on the right, here's the NES's composite video output run directly into the RetroTink 4K. Sure, direct composite is better, but this is a great example of how clean RF could look, even with a free crappy VCR. And just for fun, here's a comparison of the free VCR versus a high-end one that I own. I guess there's a quality difference, but certainly not enough to justify the price of hunting down a nice one. You could decide for yourself, but I'd be more than happy with connecting RF through a free VCR and not obsessing over small stuff. I mean, if you're going to obsess over RF, you might as well just upgrade to composite video or higher. Even if you're outside of a major city, you might still run into issues. The first thing to check would be the RF adapter itself. If you're getting a bad signal or no signal at all, just try switching to an RCA cable and coax adapter. Some of the pass-through components in those RF switches can fail, so simply removing that from the equation might help. If that doesn't work, maybe move the console to a slightly different location. Since RF is basically just a radio frequency broadcast over a wire instead of an antenna, modern wireless signals could affect it. Heck, even placing your hand near it could affect the signal. And if even that doesn't work, it might be the console itself. Check out this 4-switch Atari 2600. The interference is pretty bad, right? But when we switch over to a different 2600, even in the same exact location, using the same game cartridge, power supply, RCA cable, and coax adapter, it's basically clean. That other console might have components like the capacitors and possibly voltage regulator that need replacing. In fact, if the capacitors are leaking and not just drying out, the fluid can corrode the motherboard and eventually damage it beyond repair. If your console is in that kind of condition, you could look into doing a full restoration, including capacitor replacement. If you're going to do that, you might consider a composite video mod for it as well. I recently tested an original RF-only Famicom with a new rear board and composite video mod. Heck, this one even had a replacement motherboard in case. Not only will the new parts probably double the life of this already old console, the composite video output looks excellent. Some consoles could even be modded for S-Video or RGB, or even component video for an even higher quality output. I realize this video is trying to show you plug-and-play solutions, but sometimes a mod really is the best answer. Oh, and the old components issue definitely applies to VCRs too. So if you get a free old VCR and it looks terrible, maybe try another. That might be a pain for some people, but there's still a ton of junk stores around me that sell VCRs for $10 or less, so that might be an option. One last thing to mention, and this is a weird one. I've had quite a few people ask me about using an RF transmitter to connect their RF-only consoles wirelessly to their displays. This would allow you to keep your RF-only console closer to your setup for easy access to the switches and to compensate for the short controller cable. While it absolutely will work, you'll most likely run into even more wireless interference issues than just using a cable. If you're a nerd like me that enjoys projects like that just because you like tinkering, then absolutely go for it. But if not, definitely stick to a cable because it'll almost surely be a better option. So that's basically it. RF video can look good, but it depends on environmental factors and the condition of your console. Maybe your setup will look fine using just RF, or maybe you'll want to upgrade. Totally up to you. If you have multiple consoles that only output RF, there's a few ways to connect them all at once. The first is simply daisy chaining adapters together, or using one RF adapter and one RCA to coax for the second. If you're just connecting two, this might be the easiest solution. Heck, if you set the consoles to output to the same channel, you won't even need to change that on your VCR. Also, if you accidentally power them on both at the same time, it's totally safe, but the quality will drop, so try and only power one on at a time. Another solution is to run the RF's RCA cable into a composite switch box. Now, this will not magically convert RF to composite, but check this out. Either connect the built-in RF cable or use any RCA cable to connect the RF out of the console to the RCA input on basically any switch. Then connect another RCA cable and one of those coax adapters from the switch's output to the VCR's input. Now you could use the switch box to toggle between consoles. And once again, if they're all set to the same RF channel, you won't even need to change that on your VCR. Just power it on and select which console you'd like to use. A quick note for my fellow nerds watching, it's 100% safe to split mono audio to stereo like I've been showing in this video. I did a whole deep dive video that uses an oscilloscope to prove it's okay to do that with audio. Just don't ever use a Y cable with any video signal, including RF. It might seem fine to do something like combine two RF adapters with a Y cable instead of using a switch, but you'll put double the load on the console and the console's chips could fry. And look, don't bother going into the comments to tell me that you've been splitting composite video this way for years and it's fine. That's exactly like saying I've been smoking for years and I'm not dead, so smoking doesn't hurt anybody. Don't be an idiot, don't use Y cables with video of any kind. Smoke if you got 'em, I guess, though. Anyway. So having multiple RF consoles is easy and totally safe as long as you do it the right way. And this would work the same way on CRTs too, so feel free to use this tip there as well. Okay, this wouldn't be a RetroRGB video without doing some kind of lag testing. So let's make sure that adding a VCR to your setup won't add any latency at all. Here's how we're going to test. I'm going to take a device called a time sleuth and route it directly through a CRT's composite video inputs. To do this, I need to use an HDMI to component video converter. I'll simply connect the component video's green output to the CRT to get a signal. It'll only work in black and white, but that's all we need for this test. Now I'm going to hold the sensor on the time sleuth to the TV. This will measure how much time it takes from when the time sleuth sends its signal to when the TV displays it. As you can see, we're getting a reading of 0 milliseconds. It's actually common to get a reading of 1 or 2 milliseconds from a consumer-grade CRT, but that's because the overscan area is hidden behind the plastic. If you're able to set the geometry in your TV or use a professional monitor, this would read 0. Now let's connect video from the converter into the VCR's composite video input. Then we'll use the VCR's RF out to go to the TV, the opposite of what we're doing with game consoles, but it's the same circuit and same reading. And the latency is the exact same as when the VCR wasn't there at all, proving basic VCRs like this don't add any lag. Oh, and as a note, this also proves that HDMI to component video converter is 0 lag as well. It's odd how many people comment that it's impossible to do a 0 lag analog to digital or digital to analog conversion, but once again, that's what you're seeing right here. This also proves it's fine to use a VCR to route composite video signals into a CRT that only has an RF input. And sure, just getting an RF adapter for your console is probably a better idea for any CRT that only has an RF input. If you already have a VCR lying around, that's free, so you might as well give that a try first. Oh, and just for fun, let's see what happens when we connect the lag testing device through that DVD VCR combo unit with the HDMI output. Yeah, this is terrible. Fine for VHS, but never for gaming. This is one of the many reasons why I said just stick with a basic VCR for this. As a note, VCRs like this are basically using the same scaling circuit that's found in those cheap composite to HDMI converters. Those are only designed for VCRs, not game consoles. So always use a RetroTink similar to connect your consoles to a flat panel. Never stuff designed for VCRs or DVD players. So you might think, since you've gone through all this trouble to get a VCR in your setup, why not use it to watch old tapes on your flat panel? You could, but you might run into an issue: time-based correction. See, scalers like the RetroTink 2X were designed specifically for video game consoles, not VCRs. There's a chance that unless your VCR is one of the rare fancy ones with time-based correction built in, it'll either constantly drop the signal or it won't detect it at all. Now, there's absolutely no harm in trying, so if you want to watch a tape, just give it a go. If your tapes are in decent shape, it might work perfectly fine, so it's worth trying. Higher-end scalers like the RetroTink 5X actually have a time-based correction mode built in just for this purpose. Kind of funny that standalone time-based correctors sometimes sell for over $1,000, but a $325 retro gaming scaler has a similar feature built right in. But either way, if your retro gaming scaler won't play your tapes or keeps dropping signal, you might want to try one of those really cheap composite to HDMI converters. They won't replace a true TVC, but they were designed for VCRs and might be a bit more tolerant. Once again, please don't use these for gaming. They really were designed for just this purpose. One more thing to note, if you're going to be watching VHS tapes, that's when you might want to spend the time to find a VCR with stereo audio outputs. In fact, if this is important to you, finding one with S-video outputs might be worth it as well. I wouldn't go crazy, but if they're easy to find for a decent price, you'd probably notice a quality difference, even on home videos. I'll have a whole deep dive video on VHS capture soon, so if you're not sure if this is something you want to get into yet, I'm sticking with my original advice of just telling you to get the cheapest or free VCR if you could find one, and then worry about video capture sometime in the future. Okay, now let's get weird. Since you're using a VCR to route RF video, why not use it for one of its originally intended uses, recording? I think it'd be pretty neat to record video from your consoles the same way that you would have back in the day when these things were mainstream, but you're going to run into the same issues that you would have when you're capturing direct game console footage. I'll explain. Here's a Super Nintendo connected through a VCR's composite input, but the results would be exactly the same with RF. I'll show this example on a CRT as it doesn't care about resolution, only frequency. More on that in a sec. Now let's hit record and load up software called the 240p Test Suite. I'll navigate over to a test that flickers the cursor on screen. And as a note, if you're not watching this video in 4K or if you have a bad connection, streaming compression is going to ruin this example. But if it looks right, you should see the cursor flickering. This is a trick used to prove the TV is running in progressive scan 240 mode, something that you'd never have to worry about with CRTs, but will become relevant in a moment. Now let's play back that recording using just the tape. I'll even disconnect the SNES to show I'm only using the VCR. As you can see, it flickers just like it did when I was playing it live. While yes, you could probably notice a dip in quality, as VHS is a very lossy format, you could clearly see the cursor is still flickering, proving the recording is good. Now, let's play that VHS tape through the same player into the RetroTink 5X. Once again, it looks the same. Great. But now let's play the tape through one of those generic composite to HDMI converters. Not only is the image worse, but the cursor doesn't flicker the way it's supposed to. That's because those cheap devices were designed for interlaced video signals like TV and movies, not progressive scan like video games. That's not an issue with CRTs, as they only care about frequency. See, both 240p and 480i video run at 15 kHz, and that's all that matters to this VCR and CRT. But those cheap converters and most capture cards will ruin the image of video games, as well as add a ton of lag. So that was just a long way of saying you're going to run into the same issues playing back game footage captured with a VCR as you would connecting your consoles directly. I just wanted to show some examples to help explain. So this video originally started out as a very quick way to demonstrate how people could connect their RF-only consoles to a RetroTink, but as soon as I started digging into it, I really just loved nerding out, digging deep into RF and all of the fun and weird use cases that you could apply this stuff to. I figured maybe if you're old like me, you forgot how those RF adapters worked, or never realized they were just a switch. And if you're too young to have ever used an RF console, now you see the hoops we used to jump through just to get our consoles working. At least we never had to wait for a software update to finish just to start playing our games though. Anyway, if you liked this video, please consider subscribing to the channel, and there's plenty of ways to support even more, including ones that are completely free. Clicking on the RetroRGB support page and scrolling down will bring you to affiliate links that let you buy stuff from Amazon at the exact same price, but we get a small cut. Just click that link before going to your cart to help us out. If you're not super into this stuff, but are feeling generous, maybe leave a tip directly through PayPal or Ko-fi. Even the smallest tip is appreciated, and links are on that same support page. And if you rely on info like this, please consider signing up for monthly support services like Patreon and Floatplane. We recently turned off all ads on RetroRGB.com to make the experience better, but there's no way we could have afforded that without amazing monthly supporters. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.